Keira Knightley opens up about Johnny Depp's behavior on Pirates of the Caribbean. Said they looked perfect on screen, the daring pirate and the fearless young woman sailing through storms of chaos and charm. But behind the magic, far away from the glittering waves of the Caribbean, the truth wasn't nearly as effortless as it seemed. Keira Knightley was only 19 when she first stepped onto that colossal Disney set beside Johnny Depp, a man whose unpredictable brilliance shaped every single scene he touched. For the world, their chemistry became cinematic gold, but for Keira, it became something far more complex, an experience that blurred the line between admiration and unease. Years later, she's finally breaking her silence, revealing what it truly felt like to stand beside a legend whose light was as blinding as it was captivating. What did she see? What did she feel? And why, after all this time, has she chosen to speak now? Before she became a household name, Keira Knightley was just a 19-year-old girl stepping into a world much bigger than she had ever imagined. It was the year 2002. Hollywood was buzzing with whispers about Disney's latest gamble, a swashbuckling adventure based on a theme park ride. To many, it sounded like folly. But for Keira, Pirates of the Caribbean, The Curse of the Black Pearl was the chance of a lifetime. Fresh off her breakout success in Bend It Like Beckham, she was suddenly being offered the role of Elizabeth Swann, opposite Johnny Depp, one of Hollywood's most magnetic and unpredictable stars. At the time, she couldn't possibly know what that opportunity would mean. "I thought it would be a fun summer job," she once laughed. But that summer job would transform her life, launching her into a whirlwind of fame, sequels, and global adoration. Behind the curtain of glamour, though, was something no one had prepared her for. Johnny Depp, already a legend, was known for vanishing into his characters, admired, feared, and at times untouchable. His process was as unconventional as it was mesmerizing. He lived in a rhythm entirely his own, unpredictable, brilliant, and often chaotic. Keira, by contrast, was new to the politics of power on a massive studio production. The difference between them wasn't just age, it was legacy. Johnny had decades of fame behind him. Keira was barely out of her teens. And yet, the chemistry between them, between Elizabeth Swann and Captain Jack Sparrow, was undeniable, raw, and electric. On screen, it was cinematic perfection. Off-screen, it was a masterclass in navigating the unpredictable world of a Hollywood giant. When Keira Knightley first met Johnny Depp, she didn't just meet an actor, she met a legend, a man whose very presence seemed to bend the air around him. At that time, Johnny wasn't simply another movie star. He was the Hollywood enigma, the man who had built his fame on misfits and outsiders, on characters that blurred the line between brilliance and madness. His deep, slurred voice carried both humor and menace, and his eyes, those half-lidded, knowing eyes, hinted at stories only he could tell. To everyone around him, Depp was mystery wrapped in magnetism. He didn't demand attention, it simply followed him. And on the set of Pirates of the Caribbean, that magnetism became its own kind of force. Keira was barely 19, Depp was 40. Their worlds couldn't have been more different. He carried decades of fame, Edward Scissorhands, Sleepy Hollow, Donnie Brasco, roles that had already etched him into Hollywood history. When he arrived on set as Captain Jack Sparrow, the crew didn't just see an actor, they saw an icon rewriting the rules of cinema as he went. Every gesture, every slurred line, every stumble that seemed accidental was part of a calculated chaos. It was art. And everyone on set, from the producers to the newest crew member, adjusted to his rhythm. Depp's process was half genius, half a storm. He ignored scripts, reinvented lines, and gave the pirate a drunken rhythm that left Disney executives terrified at first, but audiences later adored. Nobody could have played Jack like Johnny, Keira would later say. He took something that could have been cartoonish and made it alive. Yet behind that admiration was an awareness, a silent understanding of how much power he held. When Johnny spoke, the set paused. When he laughed, everyone followed. When he grew quiet, even the waves seemed to hush. It wasn't just respect. It was a mix of awe and unease. Keira felt it too. Acting opposite him was like walking a tightrope. Thrilling, but never entirely safe. One moment, he was all charm and laughter. The next, distant and unreadable. His unpredictability was magic on a screen, but it carried weight off it, a gravity that shaped every moment, every emotion, every unspoken word between them. He was the kind of person who could change the entire mood of a room without saying a single word, one insider recalled. And for Keira, so young, so eager to prove herself, that aura was both an inspiration and a test. As the cameras rolled and the waves crashed against the decks of the Black Pearl, everything looked perfect from the outside. Laughter, music, the illusion of movie magic. But beneath that glittering surface, Keira Knightley began to feel something shift, something quiet, yet unsettling. It wasn't one dramatic moment, no explosive confrontation. It was a series of subtle experiences, glances, tones, gestures, small enough to ignore, but sharp enough to leave marks. They weren't the kind of moments that make headlines. They were the kind that to stay with you long after the director calls cut. Johnny Depp was the gravitational center of that universe. His charm was intoxicating, but it came with volatility. One day, he'd be warm, playful, joking with the crew. The next, he'd withdraw completely, lost in his own world of thought and silence. For a 19-year-old still finding her footing in Hollywood, this emotional whiplash was confusing. She admired him deeply. Who wouldn't? He was Captain Jack Sparrow, the living, breathing embodiment of rebellion and charisma. But slowly, that admiration began to intertwine with unease. Keira noticed how the entire atmosphere on set would shift depending on his mood. When Johnny smiled, the crew exhaled. When he didn't, the tension thickened like fog. She once said, "When the person at the top of the call sheet changes, everything changes." It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation born of experience. And then there were the jokes. Some were funny, sharp, and clever. Others, not so much. His humor could swing between charming and cutting, playful and provocative. Sometimes a line would blur, a moment that felt more uncomfortable than comedic. Keira would laugh it off, as everyone did. Not out of agreement, but out of instinct. Because in that world, silence was safer than disapproval. The Caribbean sun was relentless, the hours long, the environment isolating. There were no breaks from the world they were building, only a small island of people, whispers, and exhaustion. Privacy was a myth, and boundaries blurred easily. Keira watched how the crew moved around Depp, deferential, cautious, almost reverent. She didn't have the words back then to describe what she was feeling. It wasn't fear exactly, it was awareness. A constant hum of knowing that one wrong reaction, One misplaced look could tip the balance. So she focused on control, her lines, her movements, her discipline. Every day was a lesson in self-preservation. You learn people quickly, she would later say, especially when you're young and trying not to step on anyone's toes. And yet, deep down, she could feel the difference between acting and reality, between admiration and survival. Scenes that seemed part of Jack Sparrow's drunken charm sometimes didn't feel like acting at all. She would never call it abusive. It wasn't that simple. It was 1,000 tiny imbalances, a silent pressure that shaped her understanding of Hollywood long before she realized it. Pirates of the Caribbean didn't just make her famous, it taught her the price of silence and how small one could feel inside a massive, powerful machine. Every great film has its breaking points. Those moments when the line between acting and reality begins to blur. For Keira Knightley, Pirates of the Caribbean had more than a few of them. The production was enormous, a floating world of swords, sweat, and salt water. Every take demanded perfection. Every expression had to carry weight. Yet behind the dazzling sea battles and a sweeping romance, there were scenes that tested her in ways few ever saw. Johnny Depp's creative process was as unpredictable as the tides he liked to push, to twist, to reinvent. Sometimes his improvisations were breathtaking, flashes of genius that turned simple dialogue into cinematic gold. Other times, they were disorienting. You never quite knew what would happen once the camera started. One crew member later recalled. He changed lines, changed tone, moved closer than anyone expected. Everyone just went along with it. One scene, in particular, became a quiet test of her composure. It was written as a playful exchange between Jack and Elizabeth, flirtatious, charged with tension. But during filming, Depp shifted the energy mid-take, leaning further into the moment than rehearsed. Keira didn't flinch. She stayed in character, delivered her lines, and smiled when the director called cut. But inside, she knew something had changed. It wasn't scandalous, just unsettling. A reminder that spontaneity, when driven by power, can sometimes leave the other person without a choice. On other days, the discomfort wasn't about physical closeness, but atmosphere. Depp's moods swung with unpredictable rhythm. When he was vibrant, the set sparkled. When he retreated into silence, everyone followed. Conversations grew cautious, laughter quieter. For Keira, walking into a scene often felt like stepping onto shifting sand, and beyond the set, there was another storm, the media. The film's success made her an instant celebrity. Each sequel brought not only higher expectations, but endless speculation about her and her co-stars, especially Depp and Orlando Bloom. Tabloids spun fantasies. Interviews blurred truth with gossip. And through it all, Keira smiled. The picture of composure, professionalism, grace. She was incredibly composed for someone so young, a member of the crew said. You could see her deciding when to speak, when to stay silent. That silence was her armor. In Hollywood, silence often looks like grace. It's rewarded. It keeps the peace. But it can also weigh heavily, a quiet burden that teaches young women how to survive, not how to thrive. Keira learned that lesson early. She understood that in a business built on image, being easy to work with was both a compliment and a cage. Those taxing scenes taught her something no acting class could: how to protect herself while keeping the illusion alive, how to stay steady in the chaos of someone else's storm. In Hollywood, silence can be both armor and prison. For Keira Knightley, during her Pirates of the Caribbean years, it became both. She spoke warmly in interviews, praising the crew, the director, even Johnny Depp's extraordinary talent. But the space between her words, the pauses that lingered, carried a different story. Silence, for her, wasn't ignorance. It was survival. At 19, she was working among powerful men, producers, executives, and the stars, with reputations that loomed like shadows. The unspoken rule was simple: keep the peace, don't make waves. She watched how others navigated Depp's mercurial moods, how laughter often replaced discomfort, how unpredictability was romanticized as genius. No one meant harm. It was the system, a culture built on the belief that brilliance excused imbalance, that a young actress's discomfort was just part of the job. Years later, when Keira described those days, her tone was calm but deliberate. "I was lucky to work with him," she said, and she meant it. But beneath that word, lucky, lived a truth she could never fully voice then, that talent and tension often coexisted in the same room. She understood, even back then, the delicate calculation every young actress learns when speaking up could cost more than staying quiet. She was building her career, becoming Hollywood's new it girl, appearing on magazine covers, walking red carpets. In that spotlight, a misunderstood comment could rewrite everything. So she smiled, she charmed, she endured, and the world applauded her professionalism. But silence leaves marks, too. It can chip away at confidence, blur boundaries, and turn admiration into caution. Keira became hyper-aware of her words, her gestures, even her laughter. Every step had to be measured, every answer rehearsed. Her identity, at times, felt tethered to someone else's orbit. Even as she built her legacy, her name remained entwined with his. When she finally looked back, years later, she didn't speak with anger, but with clarity. It was a weird world to grow up in, she admitted. Not the fame, not the fortune, but the quiet rules, the hierarchy, the silence, the way young women learned to adapt rather than question. The irony was cruel. Pirate of the Caribbean made her a global star, but it also stole a piece of her innocence, teaching her diplomacy before she'd even learned rebellion. The most important thing, she once said softly, was to keep people happy. That's how you survived. And so she did. She learned to endure storms with a smile, to walk through discomfort in heels and corsets, and to carry her silence like a secret crown. But the cost of that silence? It lingered, not in scandal or headlines, but in the quiet weight she carried long after the cameras stopped rolling. For nearly 2 decades, Keira Knightley kept her memories of the Pirates of the Caribbean years sealed behind careful smiles and diplomatic words. She never joined the noise, never added to the rumors, never sought to rekindle the past. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was wisdom. But as time passed, that silence began to feel heavier than the truth itself. When she finally chose to speak, her words were not driven by resentment, but by reflection. She had grown as a woman, as an artist, and as someone who had witnessed Hollywood change in profound ways. The world she entered at 19 no longer existed. The unspoken rules that once protected power were being questioned, dismantled, and rewritten. It was a very strange thing, she said gently, to be a teenager in that world. She wasn't describing trauma, she was describing imbalance, the way charm could blur with control, the way charisma could silence others without even trying, and the way young women were taught to adapt instead of to ask. Her decision to speak wasn't about exposing anyone, it was about context, about acknowledging that what once felt normal was never truly acceptable. The modern Me Too movement had opened doors that were once locked shut. Conversations about power, silence, and respect flooded the industry, and for the first time, Keira felt she could breathe in that new air without fear. I was very little, she recalled softly, and when you are little in such a surrounding, you become an adapter rather than a questioner. That sentence alone revealed everything, not just about her, but about countless others who learned to survive by blending in, by keeping quiet, by reading the room instead of rewriting it. She didn't blame Johnny Depp, she didn't villainize him. In fact, she spoke of him with empathy, acknowledging his brilliance, his depth, and yes, his difficulty. It was a peculiar mix, she said, admiration and discomfort, both burning at the same time. Her honesty was not an attack, it was a kind of liberation, a way to close a chapter without rewriting history. It's not about blame, she explained, it's about honesty, about saying this is what it was like, and finally allowing that truth to exist. Her calm, her grace, her restraint, that was her power. There were no sensational headlines, no bitterness, no shock value, just truth, spoken gently, finely. And as she spoke, something remarkable happened. Her story stopped being about one actor and became about an entire generation of women who learned that silence is not the same as peace. Speaking now wasn't rebellion, it was release. It was Keira Knightley reclaiming her own story, not as the governor's daughter trapped in a corset, but as a woman unafraid to look back and say, this is what it really felt like. When Keira Knightley finally opened up about her experience on the Pirates of the Caribbean set, the world leaned in to listen, not because she was spilling secrets or seeking revenge, but because her honesty carried the rare weight of reflection. In an industry obsessed with drama and scandal, her calm, deliberate truth was almost revolutionary. She didn't point fingers, she didn't accuse, she simply illuminated. What she said wasn't explosive. What made it powerful was what she didn't have to say. Fans revisited the old films, watching her scenes with Johnny Depp through new eyes, looking for clues, for signs, for unspoken tension. Some called her words insightful, saying they revealed what it truly meant to be young, female, and talented in an industry built on imbalance. Others defended Depp, interpreting her recollections as nostalgia, not criticism. But most agreed. Keira's voice, steady, wise, and deeply human, offered something the world needed. A reminder that behind every billion-dollar franchise are real people navigating power, vulnerability, and silence. Her story didn't destroy Pirates of the Caribbean. It reframed it. It shifted the conversation from spectacle to substance, from fantasy to truth. It revealed that even on the most magical sets, there are undercurrents of control, hierarchy, and the quiet endurance of those who learn to survive within them. Depp's loyal fans dissected her every word, searching for offense, but even they couldn't deny her grace. She had spoken not out of spite, but out of wisdom. Her reflections were about imbalance, not betrayal, about truth, not revenge, and that truth echoed far beyond her own career. For every line she spoke, hundreds of women nodded in silent recognition. Actresses, assistants, dreamers who had once been told that discomfort was just part of the job. Through her calm, measured words, Keira gave those women a voice, a validation, that their quiet unease had never been theirs alone. Her transformation was complete. She was no longer just Elizabeth a Swan, the brave young woman standing beside a charming pirate. She was Keira Knightley, a woman who faced that same charm in real life and emerged not with bitterness, but with clarity. In later interviews, she spoke with gratitude rather than regret. That period was my education, she said. It taught me how to adapt, how to protect myself, and how to speak when it matters. It was never about anger, it was about understanding. She recognized that pirates had opened the world to her, but it also revealed how fragile fame could be when power wasn't shared equally. Since then, her film choices have reflected that growth. Atonement, The Imitation Game, Colette, stories of women reclaiming their voices, their identities, their agency. I prefer parts where women control their own stories, she once said. And perhaps that, more than anything, is her lasting legacy, because Keira Knightley's journey isn't just about what happened then, it's about what she chose to do after. Her story reminds us that silence has a cost, but truth, spoken with grace, has the power to change how history remembers you, and maybe how Hollywood remembers itself. As the waves of Pirates of the Caribbean fade into memory, one thing remains clear. Keira Knightley's courage to speak softly carries more strength than 1,000 shouts. Her story is not one of scandal, but of growth, not of blame, but of balance, not of brokenness, but of becoming. She has stepped onto that set as a teenage girl in a world ruled by giants, and walked away a woman who understood what power really looks like when wrapped in silence. Years later, she no longer sails under anyone's shadow. Instead, she rides her own course, one defined by integrity, empathy, and the quiet resilience of someone who has seen both the magic and the cost of Hollywood. Keira Knightley's legacy is no longer just about Elizabeth a Swan, the brave heroine who fought pirates and cursed seas. It's about the real woman behind the character, the one who fought for her voice in an industry that once told her to stay quiet. And perhaps that's the truest kind of rebellion. So now, when we rewatch those iconic scenes, the sword fights, the laughter, the glimmer of adventure, we can see something deeper in her eyes, not just acting, not just youth, but wisdom being born in real time. Fame doesn't erase friction, and silence doesn't mean peace, but honesty, while spoken at last, can turn a memory into meaning. What do you think truly happened behind those legendary scenes? And how much do we owe to those who finally find the courage to speak? If you want more untold stories of Hollywood's brightest legends, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned. Because behind every movie you love, there's a story waiting to be uncovered.